This is the second of 2 tapes on the Constitutional Convention and the second of an 8-tape series on the U.S. Constitution.
The summer of 1787 was a scorcher, one of the hottest ever recalled by Philadelphians. Delegates to the Constitutional Convention sweltered and pressed on. They sharpened their arguments and their tongues, they drew battle lines, they wheeled and dealed behind the scenes, and they finally reached that unique compromise of theory and practice known as the Constitution of the United States. Among the many compromises in the Constitution, one stands out above others. Historians call it the Great Compromise. This agreement, reached on July 16th, apportioned votes according to population in the House of Representatives, but it awarded equal votes to all states in the Senate. This settlement between large states and small states was a child of necessity. Without it, the convention would have disintegrated amidst hostility and dissension. Without it, the document we know as the Constitution of the United States would not exist. Because the Great Compromise was so significant, we shall focus on it in this presentation, but we should keep 2 things in mind. First, the Constitutional Convention did not advance along a straight, smooth line. It skipped and hopped from one subject to another. It started and stalled. It moved forward to the new and backward to the old. Second, historians often use labels such as nationalist and federalist to describe convention delegates. These labels help us understand the logic of political decisions made during the convention. But labels can also mislead. Flesh and blood people, not bundles of pure logic, roam the East Room of Independence Hall. People, unlike logic, feel, fight, and fume. People, unlike logic, sell out, compromise, and strike deals. And people, unlike logic, can be illogical. Wednesday, June 6th, was the 10th day of convention business. Delegates were still sitting as a committee of the whole. They were still feeling each other out with preliminary arguments and votes. During the previous 9 sessions, the committee of the whole had discussed a prospectus for a new constitution known as the Virginia Plan. Now, on the 10th day, delegates backtracked and began to cover the same territory over again. What began as a skirmish over proportional representation was about to erupt into a major battle. It would end in a truce, the Great Compromise. In the 10th session, delegates again exchanged ideas on how to elect the first branch of the national legislature, the House of Representatives. The Virginia Plan called for election by the people. This method, warned Connecticut's Roger Sherman, threatened the very existence of state governments.
If it were in view to abolish the state governments, the elections ought to be by the people. If the state governments are to be continued, it is necessary, in order to preserve harmony between the national and state governments, that elections to the national government ought to be made by the state governments. The right of participating in the national government would be sufficiently secured to the people by their election of the state legislatures. The objects of the Union, I think, are few. First, defense against foreign danger. Secondly, against internal disputes and a resort to force. Thirdly, treaties with foreign nations. Fourthly, regulating foreign commerce and drawing revenue from it. These, and perhaps a few lesser objects, alone render a confederation of the states necessary. All other matters, civil and criminal, would be much better in the hands of the states. The people are more happy in small than in large states. I am for giving the general government power to legislate and execute within a defined province.
The people, Sherman said, are happier in small states. This was part of the political wisdom in 18th century America. Liberty, many Americans believed, can survive only in republics, that is, in representative governments controlled by the people. And these republics, if they are to avoid degenerating into tyranny, must be confined within small geographical areas. Why? Well, for 2 reasons, essentially. First, in small republics, the people can keep a close eye and a short leash on their political representatives. Second, small communities are likely to share common values, so they will escape the destructive collision of different factions or interest groups competing for the reins of power. James Madison, a nationalist who wished to lessen the power of state governments, disagreed with this argument. Liberty, he believed, is forever threatened by majorities seeking to repress minorities. This danger is intensified in a small community because a small community lacks competing factions with numbers sufficient to resist a tyrannical majority. The solution? Enlarge the territory, said Madison. Introduce additional factions and thereby render it more difficult for any single interest group to prevail. A federal government with authority over a vast territory achieves this goal. This is Madison's theory of factions, a theory he later made famous in the Federalist Papers. Here is how Madison introduced his argument during the convention.
All civilized societies are divided into different sects, factions, and interests, as they happen to consist of rich and poor, debtors and creditors, the landed, the manufacturing, the commercial interests, the inhabitants of this district or that district, the followers of this political leader or that political leader, the disciples of this religious sect or that religious sect. In all cases where a majority are united by a common interest or passion, the rights of the minority are in danger. What motives are to restrain them? A prudent regard to the maxim that honesty is the best policy is found by experience to be as little regarded by bodies of men as by individuals. Respect for character is always diminished in proportion to the number among whom the blame or praise is to be divided. Conscience, the only remaining tie, is known to be inadequate in individuals. In large numbers, little is to be expected from it. Besides, religion itself may become a motive to persecution and oppression. These observations are verified by the histories of every country, ancient and modern.
America's problems, Madison contended, sprang from unrestricted democracy, from majorities imposing their wills on minorities without regard for justice.
What has been the source of those unjust laws complained of among ourselves? Has it not been the real or supposed interest of the major number? Debtors have defrauded their creditors. The landed interest has borne hard on the mercantile interest. The holders of one species of property have thrown a disproportion of taxes on the holders of another species. The lesson we are to draw from the whole is that where a majority are united by a common sentiment and have an opportunity, the rights of the minor party become insecure. In a republican government, the majority, if united, have always an opportunity.
Madison offered his solution.
The only remedy is to enlarge the sphere and thereby divide the community into so great a number of interests and parties that in the first place a majority will not be likely at the same moment to have a common interest separate from that of the whole or of the minority, and in the second place that in case they should have such an interest, they may not be so apt to unite in the pursuit of it. It is incumbent on us, then, to try this remedy, and with that view to frame a republican system on such a scale and in such a form as will control all the evils which have been experienced.
After Madison enlightened delegates with his theory of factions, Georgia's William Pierce brought them back to the business at hand. Pierce suggested a compromise that would be included in the final Constitution. The House of Representatives should be elected by the people, whereas the Senate should be elected by the state legislatures. This, Pierce argued, would assure both individuals and states a place in the national legislature. Previously, the Committee of the Whole had voted for a popularly elected House, and this decision held up in a second round of voting. But there remained the troublesome issue of how to elect the Senate. On June 7th, Delaware's John Dickinson moved for members of the Senate to be elected by state legislatures. This provoked more debate on the role of states in a national government. Dickinson defended his motion.
I have two reasons for my motion. First, because the sense of the states would be better collected through their governments than immediately from the people at large. Secondly, because I wish the Senate to consist of the most distinguished characters. distinguished from their rank in life and their weight of property, and bearing as strong a likeness to the British House of Lords as possible. I think such characters more likely to be selected by the state legislatures than in any other mode.
Dickinson's argument contained two important assumptions shared by most delegates. First, the Senate should restrain the democratic excesses of the popularly elected House of Representatives, and this is possible only if senators themselves are not at the mercy of fluctuating and self-serving majorities. Election to the Senate, therefore, should not rest with the people. Second, senators elected by state legislatures would generally be more wise and virtuous than senators elected directly by the people. The reasoning here is somewhat alien to our modern way of thinking, but it was common among 18th century Americans. Elections, these Americans believed, are like a filter, sifting out incompetent and evil men. Thus, state legislators elected by the people would tend to be more wise and virtuous than the people themselves. If, in turn, these elected officials elect national senators, more sifting and refinement occurs. So senators elected indirectly by state legislatures will tend to be more wise and virtuous than senators elected directly by the people. Such wise and virtuous men were seen as indispensable to a national Senate, a Senate that would bridle democratic excesses and prevent majorities from trampling on the rights of minorities. These assumptions illuminate some other beliefs of convention delegates. For example, most delegates agreed that the Senate, however elected, should contain far fewer members than the House. Why? Because a small Senate would be able to deliberate calmly and rationally. It would be able to avoid the turbulent infighting and scrambling for votes so common in large assemblies. When delegates cautioned against democratic excess, they often had economic issues in mind, such as paper money printed by states. This subject was raised by Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts in his defense of a Senate elected by state legislatures. Gerry divided Americans into two economic classes, a landed or agricultural interest and a commercial interest. Most Americans were small farmers, so the landed interest was numerically stronger than the commercial interest. The agricultural class, according to Gerry, desired depreciated paper money to pay off their commercial creditors. Therefore, the minority, the commercial interest, needed an institution to defend itself against being cheated by the majority, the landed interest. Gerry believed a Senate elected by state legislatures would furnish this protection.
4 modes of appointing the Senate have been mentioned. First, by the first branch of the national legislature. This would create a dependence contrary to the end proposed. Secondly, by the national executive. This is a stride towards monarchy that few will think of. Thirdly, by the people. The people have 2 great interests, the landed interest and the commercial interest, including the stockholders. To draw both branches from the people will leave no security to the commercial interest, the people being chiefly composed of the landed interest, and erroneously supposing that the other interests are adverse to it. Fourthly, by the individual legislatures. The elections being carried through this refinement will be most likely to provide some check in favor of the commercial interest against the landed, without which oppression will take place, and no free government can last long where that is the case. I am therefore in favor of election by the state legislatures.
The arguments of Dickinson and Gerry contained a stumbling block, and Madison identified it. Madison detested the rage for paper money as much as any delegate. But, he argued, this and other democratic follies were committed by the state legislatures themselves. Why, then, should Americans entrust the election of senators to these unreliable assemblies?
The great evils complained of are that the state legislatures ran into schemes of paper money, etc., whenever solicited by the people, and sometimes without even the sanction of the people. Their influence, then, instead of checking a like propensity in the national legislature, may be expected to promote it. Nothing can be more contradictory than to say that the national legislature, without a proper check, will follow the example of the state legislatures, and, in the same breath, that the state legislatures are the only proper check.
Like Madison, the nationalists James Wilson and Gouverneur Morris distrusted state governments. Accordingly, Wilson and Morris called for popular election to both legislative branches. This would circumvent state legislatures and lessen their influence. This proposal alarmed many delegates who suspected that extreme nationalists like Wilson and Morris longed to dissolve the political identity of states and blend America into a single consolidated government. John Dickinson articulated the concern of these delegates. The states should retain considerable power, Dickinson argued, so they can check the power of the national government. Here we see the essence of what has become known as American federalism, a distribution of powers between state governments and the national government.
The preservation of the states in a certain degree of agency is indispensable. It will produce that collision between the different authorities which should be wished for in order to check each other. To attempt to abolish the states altogether would degrade the councils of our country, would be impracticable, would be ruinous. The proposed national system is like the solar system, in which the states are the planets and ought to be left to move freely in their proper orbits. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Wilson, wishes to extinguish these planets. If the state governments are excluded from all agency in the national one, and all power drawn from the people at large, the consequence will be that the national government will move in the same direction as the state governments now do, and will run into all the same mischiefs. The reform will only unite the 13 small streams into one great, one current, pursuing the same course without any opposition whatever.
James Wilson, a Scottish immigrant, shot back at Dickinson.
I do not see the danger of the states being devoured by the national government. On the contrary, I wish to keep them from devouring the national government. I am not, however, for extinguishing these planets, as is supposed by Mr. Dickinson. Neither do I, on the other hand, believe that they will warm or enlighten the sun. Within their proper orbits, they must still be suffered to act for subordinate purposes, for which their existence is made essential by the great extent of our country.
When it came to electing senators, the Committee of the Whole parted company with the Virginia Plan. The committee voted to place the election of senators in state legislatures, a procedure that found its way into the final Constitution. The Virginia Plan was beginning to show signs of wear. Consideration of the Virginia Plan absorbed the first 2 weeks of the convention, sitting as a committee of the whole. The Virginia Plan, a brainchild of James Madison, outlined a new constitution, a vigorous national government, and a bicameral legislature with both branches based on proportional representation. Most of the Virginia Plan sailed intact through the Committee of the Whole. Its success was largely owing to a coalition of 6 states orchestrated by James Madison. Initially, this coalition, known as the Big State Bloc, defeated the Small State Bloc on most issues. The Big State Bloc flexed its collective muscles until July 16th, when it was finally defeated in the Great Compromise. A bit of clarification is necessary here. Though historians speak of big state and small state blocks, these labels are somewhat misleading. New York, for example, was the 5th largest among 13 states, but it joined the so-called small state bloc. Why? Because 2 of its 3 delegates, Robert Yates and John Lansing, were fervently opposed to nationalism. They reflected the views of New York's Governor George Clinton and of New York's rural population. On the other hand, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia were among the less populous states, but they, along with Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, were part of the large state bloc engineered by James Madison. Why? Because delegates believed a Southern population boom was in the offing, so Southern states would eventually benefit from large state measures like proportional representation. In addition, Southern delegates rightly assumed that a deal over slaves would be made when calculating population, thereby increasing Southern power in the national legislature. The 3/5 rule adopted in the Constitution came as no surprise. This rule, known to delegates as the federal ratio, had been used previously in figuring taxes. Proportional representation in both branches of the national legislature was a mainstay of the Virginia Plan, and this rule of suffrage was its most controversial part. Recall that, on May 30th, the Committee of the Whole had postponed voting on a rule of suffrage. Delaware had threatened to withdraw from the convention if equality of suffrage, one state, one vote, was abandoned for a proportional scheme. The demand for proportional representation was viewed by small state delegates as a power grab by big states. Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts contained 45% of the population. Therefore, reasoned small state delegates, a legislature based on population would permit these states to dominate national politics. On June 9th, William Paterson of New Jersey, a general of the small state bloc, reopened discussion of this controversial subject. Small state delegates picked this time to attack proportional representation. David Brearley, Chief Justice of New Jersey Supreme Court, spoke first.
I am sorry that any question on this point was brought into view. It had been much agitated in Congress at the time of forming the Confederation, and was then rightly settled by allowing to each sovereign state an equal vote. Otherwise, the smaller states must have been destroyed instead of being saved. The substitution of a ratio, I admit, carries fairness on the face of it, but on a deeper examination is unfair and unjust. There will be 3 large states and 10 small ones. The large states, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, will carry everything before them. Small states will be obliged to throw themselves constantly into the scale of some large one in order to have any weight at all.
Defenders of proportional representation took the moral high ground. Justice demands proportional representation, they argued. Judge Brearley decided to test this supposed commitment to justice. He offered a proposal which he surely knew no large state delegate would accept.
Is it fair, it will be asked, that Georgia should have an equal vote with Virginia? I will not say it is. What remedy, then? Only one, that a map of the United States be spread out, that all the existing boundaries be erased, and that a new partition of the whole be made into 13 equal parts.
Another small state delegate repeated the challenge. Throw all states into a common hotchpot, he suggested, and divide America into 13 states with equal populations. Then the small state delegates would accede to proportional representation. If a concern for justice was the motive behind proportional representation, then clearly this was the fairest system of all. It is difficult to know how seriously small state delegates intended this hotchpot proposal, as it is called. At the very least, they must have chuckled among themselves while James Madison patiently explained that the hotchpot idea was totally impractical, that Americans would never sit still for this massive project of political engineering. Madison was right, of course, at least in regard to large states. But when small state delegates earlier had challenged the practicality of large state measures, they were often told that justice, not practicality, should be their guide. Now, with the tables turned, large state delegates abandoned justice for practicality. If nothing else, the hotspot idea probably embarrassed defenders of proportional representation and soiled the banner of justice in which they had wrapped themselves. Justice Brearley was followed by William Paterson, who questioned the power of the convention to frame a new constitution. The Confederation Congress in most states, Paterson explained, authorized delegates to amend the Articles of Confederation, not to draft a new constitution. The convention should stay within these boundaries. Earlier, Pennsylvania's James Wilson had threatened that large states might unite in union if small states balked at proportional representation. Paterson countered with his own threat, and the convention heated up.
New Jersey will never confederate on the plan before the committee. She would be swallowed up. I had rather submit to a monarch, to a despot, than to such a fate. I will not only oppose the plan here, but on my return home I will do everything in my power to defeat it there.
Tempers flared as James Wilson traded threat for threat.
If the small states will not confederate on this plan, Pennsylvania, and I presume some other states, will not confederate on any other. We have been told that, each state being sovereign, all are equal. So each man is naturally a sovereign over himself, and all men are therefore naturally equal. Can man retain this equality when he becomes a member of civil government? He cannot. As little can a sovereign state when it becomes a member of a federal government. If New Jersey will not part with her sovereignty, it is vain to talk of government.
This Saturday session was nearing an end, so delegates had a day off to cool down. When they reconvened on Monday, Connecticut's Roger Sherman opened by suggesting a compromise.
I propose that the proportion of suffrage in the first branch should be according to the respective numbers of free inhabitants, and that in the second branch, or Senate, each state should have one vote and no more.
Sherman's middle course was similar to the great compromise reached on July 16th. But for now, advocates of proportional representation saw no reason to compromise. They called for a vote on this resolution. The right of suffrage in the first branch of the national legislature ought to be according to some equitable ratio of representation. Before a vote was taken, Benjamin Franklin played the role of peacemaker, a role he assumed several times during the convention.
Mr. Chairman, it has given me great pleasure to observe that till this point the proportion of representation came before us. Our debates were carried on with great coolness and temper. If anything of a contrary kind has on this occasion appeared, I hope it will not be repeated. For we are sent here to consult, not to contend with each other, and declarations of a fixed opinion and of determined resolution never to change it neither enlighten nor convince us. Positiveness and warmth on one side naturally beget their like on the other, and tend to create and augment discord and division. In a great concern wherein harmony and union are extremely necessary to give weight to our counsels, and render them effectual in promoting and securing the common good.
The motion for proportional representation in the first House passed in the Committee of the Whole, 7 states in favor, 3 states opposed, and 1 state divided. This was not a fatal blow to small state delegates. They expected some scheme of proportional representation in the House of Representatives. When it came to the Senate, however, these delegates dug in their heels. As Sherman put it,
I move that a question be taken whether each state shall have one vote in the second branch. Everything depends on this. The smaller states will never agree to the plan on any other principle than an equality of suffrage in this branch.
Sherman's motion was defeated in a close vote, 5 states in favor, 6 states against. Then James Wilson and Alexander Hamilton moved that the right of suffrage in the Senate ought to be according to the same rule as in the first branch, that is, according to some scheme of proportional representation. This passed, 6 states in favor, 5 states against. The large state bloc remained solid and victorious, but this victory would soon prove fleeting. By June 13th, 2 weeks into the convention, the Committee of the Whole had discussed the Virginia plan point by point, and with some exceptions, such as election of the Senate, the committee had given its approval. The committee now had a revised version of the Virginia plan, one which reflected previous votes and compromises. This revised plan would undergo many additional changes during the convention. Nonetheless, it already contained important features of the final Constitution. These included a national government with 3 branches, legislative, executive, and judicial. A bicameral legislature with members of the first branch elected by the people and members of the second branch elected by the state legislatures. A right of suffrage in the first branch, the House of Representatives, based on population, with 3/5 of the slave population added to the number of free citizens. A national executive consisting of a single person. An executive veto of legislative acts, which requires a 2/3 vote of each branch to override. And finally, a national judiciary, which includes a supreme tribunal. The time had arrived for the Committee of the Whole to transform itself back into the Federal Convention, where the revised Virginia plan would be debated again. Before this occurred, however, a rival plan was introduced in committee by New Jersey's William Patterson. Usually called the New Jersey Plan, this proposal was the small state alternative to the Virginia Plan. The New Jersey Plan resembled the Virginia Plan in some ways. Whereas the Articles of Confederation had established nothing more than a national legislature, the New Jersey Plan, like the Virginia Plan, called for a central government with 3 branches, legislative, executive, and judicial. In addition, the New Jersey Plan, like the Virginia Plan, authorized the central government to enforce taxation. Despite these similarities, the New Jersey Plan differed from the Virginia Plan in a crucial way. It presented itself as a correction and enlargement of the Articles of Confederation. Now, this meant the New Jersey Plan sought to preserve a federal form of government, as the term was then understood. It sought to preserve a confederation of sovereign states, where the central government, in enforcing its laws, was authorized to move against individual states, but not against individuals within those states. New York's John Lansing was the first to speak in favor of the New Jersey Plan. This plan, he argued, preserved the federal form of government established by the Articles of Confederation, and so, unlike the Virginia Plan, it remained true to the original commission of the Convention.
I am decidedly of opinion that the power of the Convention is restrained to amendments of a federal nature, and having for their basis the Confederacy in being. The acts of Congress, the tenor of the acts of the states, the commissions produced by the several deputations, all prove this. The states limited our power to amending the Confederation. I'm sure this was the case with my state. New York would never have concurred in sending deputies to the Convention if she had supposed the deliberations were to turn on a consolidation of the states and a national government.
William Patterson agreed with Lansing.
I prefer this plan because it accords, first, with the powers of the Convention, secondly, with the sentiments of the people. If the Confederacy was radically wrong, let us return to our states and obtain larger powers, not assume them ourselves. I came here not to speak my own sentiments, but the sentiments of those who sent me. Our object is not such a government as may be best in itself, but such a one as our constituents have authorized us to prepare, and as they will approve.
James Wilson, a champion of the Virginia Plan, responded to these points.
With regard to the power of the Convention, I conceive myself authorized to conclude nothing, but to be at liberty to propose anything. With regard to the sentiments of the people, I conceive it difficult to know precisely what they are. Those of the particular circle in which one moves are commonly mistaken for the general voice. I cannot persuade myself that the state governments and sovereignties are so much the idols of the people, nor a national government so obnoxious to them as some suppose. Why should a national government be unpopular? Has it less dignity? Will each citizen enjoy under it less liberty or protection? Will a citizen of Delaware be degraded by becoming a citizen of the United States?
South Carolina's Charles Pinckney interjected a cynical note into this debate over federal versus national government.
The whole comes to this. Give New Jersey an equal vote, and she will dismiss her scruples and concur in the national system. I think the convention authorized to go any length in recommending what they find necessary to remedy the evils which produced this convention.
Pinckney's observation was reinforced by James Madison in his lengthy attack on the New Jersey Plan. The great difficulty, Madison argued, lies in the affair of representation, and if this could be adjusted, all others would be surmountable. When the New Jersey Plan faced the Virginia Plan in a committee vote, the Virginia Plan won handily with the backing of 7 states. The New Jersey Plan was too little, too late. The Virginia Plan had gained the momentum, and this momentum carried it forward as delegates transformed themselves from a committee of the whole back into the Federal Convention. Now it was time to debate everything over again. On Wednesday, June 20th, the Committee of the Whole was no more. Delegates now sat as the Federal Convention, ready to do battle over again. They began with the first plank of the revised Virginia Plan. Resolved that it is the opinion of this committee that a national government ought to be established, consisting of a supreme legislative, executive, and judiciary. The small state New Jersey Plan, which called for a federal government instead of a national government, had gone down in defeat. But if the substance of victory eluded the small state bloc, it might at least enjoy the appearance of victory. Oliver Ellsworth from Connecticut moved to strike the hated words national government from the first plank and substitute instead the words government of the United States.
This alteration will drop the word national and retain the proper title, the United States. I wish the plan of the convention to go forth as an amendment of the Articles of Confederation, since under this idea the authority of the legislatures can ratify it. If they are unwilling, the people will be so too. If the plan goes forth to the people for ratification, several succeeding conventions within the states will be unavoidable. I do not like these conventions. They are better fitted to pull down than to build up constitutions.
Edmund Randolph, spokesman for the Virginia Plan, agreed to the change in wording, but disagreed with Ellsworth's reasons.
I do not object to the change of expression, but I apprise the gentleman who wishes for it that I do not admit it for the reasons assigned, particularly that of getting rid of a reference to the people for ratification.
The motion passed without debate, and this linguistic compromise carried over to the final Constitution. Nowhere in that document do we find the words national or national government. For the next week, delegates reconsidered various features of the Virginia Plan. Then a crucial phase of the convention began on Wednesday, June 27th, when debate resumed on the rule of suffrage in the two legislative branches. This debate consumed 14 working days and almost tore the convention apart. Ironically, delegates took time off from their feuds to celebrate the 11th anniversary of American independence. Finally, on July 16th, the Great Compromise was passed. The convention had hurdled its most serious obstacle. The Great Compromise called for proportional representation in the House of Representatives and for equal voting by states in the Senate. The 3/5 slavery clause was retained, and it was agreed that money bills could originate only in the first branch, the House. The nationalists James Madison and James Wilson never reconciled themselves to this compromise. But, as we said before, without the Great Compromise, the convention would likely have disintegrated. Now, let's glance at some of the debates during this delicate phase of the Constitutional Convention. Maryland's Attorney General, Luther Martin, led off with a rambling speech that exhausted the better part of 2 days. His speech also exhausted fellow delegates. Martin was one of America's most formidable trial lawyers and one of America's most formidable drinkers. Martin, in Madison's words, spoke with much diffuseness and considerable vehemence, suggesting that Martin was less than completely sober during his lengthy harangue. Delegates sweated in Philadelphia's heat and humidity, while Martin took 6 hours or more to explain how proportional representation undercut state sovereignty.
The dissolution of the state governments is involved in the nature of the process. The people have no right to do this without the consent of those to whom they have delegated their power for state purposes. Through their tongues only they can speak. Through their ears only they can hear. An equal vote in each state is essential to the federal idea, and this is founded in justice and freedom, not merely in policy. And though states may give up this right of sovereignty, yet they have not and ought not. The states, like individuals, are in a state of nature, equally sovereign and free. The states, being equal, cannot treat or confederate so as to give up an equality of votes without giving up their liberty.
Proportional representation, Martin argued, was really a plan for domination by the 3 large states.
The propositions on the table are a system of slavery for 10 states. Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania can do as they please, without a miraculous union of the other 10. They will have nothing to do but to gain over one of the 10, to make them complete masters of the rest. Then they can appoint an executive, a judiciary, and legislature as they please. The general government ought to be formed for the states, not for individuals. And if the states are to have votes in proportion to their numbers of people, it will be the same thing whether their representatives are chosen by the legislatures or the people. The smaller states will be equally enslaved.
This is the end of Side 1. Please fast forward and turn over your cassette.